functional fats for the next generation of meat and dairy alternatives. But will oils produced by microbes in fermentation tanks ever prove a scalable solution?
There are some fats and oils in meat products or in dairy products that are really signature, that really give rise to that actual animal taste that you associate with a well-cooked piece of meat or a dairy product. And what we do is try and ignore all the boring fats which you could otherwise get from plants, because we should leave the plant fats to them because they're obscenely efficient. But we should be really focusing in on what are the really potent and important molecules that we can bring via precision fermentation in this case.
So when it comes to the scalability of this, though, I mean, we've seen some companies out there talking about, replacing palm oil with fermentation technology. That seems pretty optimistic. But are the kind of fats you're going after then used at pretty low inclusion rates?
Yes, they are. So they're used at sub 1% inclusion rate.
Yeah.
And that is, I'd advise anyone who's at the start of their journey, look very carefully at what target molecules you're making, because the temptation is to come in and say we want to do a drop-in, because people say drop-ins are easy for the industry to take up and to adopt, right? And the problem with drop-ins though is that only a small proportion of the animal fat is actually interesting and is actually leading to that signature taste. And so if you make a drop-in, you're actually producing 80%, which could readily be substituted by a plant. Now, you don't want to be competing with plants if you're in precision fermentation, because they're always going to be cheaper. And with the palm oil example, I think it's why you see a lot of companies pivoting away from the largest scale commodity vegetable oil on the market to high value, small volume products like cosmetics, for instance. And that I think is very wise, because these are areas where you can, with low inclusion rate, build a very potent molecule, and it can make an impact in the industry.
So the other thing that obviously adds cost in any precision fermentation operation is the downstream processing. And in your case with your first product, TastyLux, it's my understanding that you're not trying to get to an ultra purified fat at the end. You've actually still got that sort of host microorganism in there, is that right? Yeah,
so that's a really interesting one for us, because my initial thought was that we need to isolate out, in this case it's a phospholipid, a long-chain polyunsaturated omega-6 phospholipid, right? And the first thought was we need to isolate this out and then do the magic with the cooking. And Anna, our CTO, said, well, let's try a crude lipid extract, and that worked really well. And then she said, let's just try the whole cell after precision fermentation. And I said, don't be silly, that's just going to taste terrible. And it worked even better than the extract. And so that, I think, is a good lesson as well. It's like, look at not only how do you make the molecule, but how do you do the downstream processing on the molecule in the most efficient way possible. Because if you can cut out steps, if you can leave it crude where that's possible, if you can make it easy, that all equates to it being much cheaper. And it all boils down to cost of goods.
So in the case of the microbes that you're working with, do they naturally produce the fats that you're looking for, or are you kind of genetically engineering them to trigger them to produce the kinds of fats you want?
Both. So in the case of TastyLux, for instance, that is a fungal strain which naturally produces the sorts of lipids that we are after. Now, we've had to do things with that strain and the growth conditions, and we've had a mutation program to try and increase the yield and the strength and try and optimize the strain. And then again, we have in the dairy space, for instance, a very strong synthetic biology program where we have many strains which are going through the pipeline to try and build exactly the right types of molecules. So we think of ourselves as being tech agnostic in that sense. We're also tinkering now with crops, and that's because if you can make an oil, a commodity scale oil via a crop, then the cogs are unbeatable.
So let's place your approach in context of some of the other kind of players in the designer fat space. We've got a couple of companies here doing kind of cell cultured fat, Hoxton Farms, Mission Barnes, and I'm sure there are others. Other companies playing around with oleogels and microencapsulating fats. Where does your approach fit into that broader context?
Cell ag, I'm personally very excited about the future of cell ag, but I do believe it is the future.
Yes.
And the time lag between now and then is indeterminate. And I think especially for something like fat, where 80-90% of the product is boring and can be substituted by a plant oil, it is not a sensible use of that technology because it is so expensive. And so the view that we have of cell ag is that it does have a role in agriculture in the future, unless you're in Florida apparently. But it is something that you have to be really careful about what you're using it for. The other one, the oleogels and the supporting technologies that help you deliver a product into the market better, fascinating. Yeah. And I think that there's a really strong overlap between what we are doing, which is concentrate on building the right molecule in the first place, and what they are doing around how you best deliver fats and oils into the food. I think there's a lot of overlap.
Yeah.
Because we're using multiple technology types, we have a lot of regulatory work to do, and so some products that we're making have no regulatory hurdles whatsoever. Yes. They can just be put into the market now because they're via existing enzymatic or chemical processes. Others, like the synthetic biology strains, are full-on GMO and a novel product.
Yes.
And this is right up the other end of the spectrum. Tasty Lux is somewhere in the middle, where it is not genetically modified, but it may well be, in some jurisdictions, a novel food material. Yeah. And so there are some regulatory steps required there. So we have started down that path, and we have submitted our first packages, and it's an interesting process, but it still takes time. The way we've structured Nourish is that we have our R&D centred around Australia. We now have a pilot facility that we've just opened in Singapore, and this is both for Tasty Lux and Creamy Lux, and it lets us do meaningful kilo quantities for our partners to use in their internal testing. So the next step, of course, is the commercial scale production. Now, we've made a conscious decision that, at least for Tasty Lux and for the initial stages of Creamy Lux, we are not going to do the fermentation ourselves. We're going to do co-manufacturing, and we've already identified partners who can do that for us. And the reason that we're doing that is because when you have a very low inclusion, a very high potency molecule, that means the volume of upscale fermentation is actually relatively low.
So you don't need a mega scale bioreactor to make this work?
Spot on. And that's what we want to avoid at all costs, because the costs are large, right? And so the approach we're taking instead is to have relatively small volume co-man fermentation. We take that material into Nourish and we do the critical value add step here. So for instance, with Tasty Lux, there are very specific Maillard reactions that you need to do, and we're very conscious to keep that in-house.
So just finally, how much money have you raised, and how challenging is it to raise money in the current environment?
So we've raised about 40 million US, and it is very challenging in the current environment. I think especially around alternative protein space, it's getting absolutely hammered at the moment, and frankly, that might be appropriate, because I think it was so overheated in terms of the investments that have been made over the last few years that it was probably unhealthy for the market. And I think that what we're seeing now is a pullback, both on the investment, but also on the way in which companies are spending and the approach that they're taking toward being more collaborative with others. And I think that this is a healthy shift. We're quite comfortable in the sense that we are distinct from the alternative protein market because we're what makes it better. Right? And as well, what we're seeing from the traditional food space has really surprised us, that the traditional players, particularly in dairy, are really crying out for specialty lipid products that really unlock their traditional food space. So a dairy partner said to us, we're making 3 billion cheese slices every year. How do we make 4 billion? Right? That's effectively the challenge that all of these companies are facing. But you have to use the same number of cows. So how do you do that? And the only way you can do it is to use really specific targeted unlocks in the ingredient list.